Japan. The crimes committed by Imperial Japan between 1937 and 1945 represent some of the most thoroughly documented atrocities of the 20th century, and they occurred across a vast geographic range that stretched from China to the Pacific Islands to the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Nanjing Massacre alone, 6 weeks of systematic killing following the fall of China's then capital in December 1937, produced a death toll historians estimate between 100,000 and 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war. Simultaneously, Unit 731 was conducting live human experimentation on prisoners in occupied Manchuria on a scale and with a methodical precision that placed it in a category almost entirely its own. Researchers deliberately infected prisoners with plague, cholera, and typhoid. They conducted surgical procedures without anesthesia to study the results. They tested weapons on living subjects to assess wound patterns. An estimated 3,000 to 12,000 people died inside the facility alone. Across the Pacific Theater, prisoners of war from Allied nations were subjected to forced labor, starvation, and systematic brutality on the Burma Railway and in prison camps throughout the region. The Death March of Bataan in 1942, in which approximately 10,000 Filipino and American prisoners of war died during a forced march under conditions of deliberate cruelty, became one of the most widely known individual atrocities of the Pacific War. Not a single member of Unit 731 was tried at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. The United States granted immunity in exchange for experimental data. Germany. The crimes of Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1945 are the most extensively prosecuted war crimes in history, and they still represent the benchmark against which all subsequent discussions of genocide and crimes against humanity are measured. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people alongside hundreds of thousands of Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and others, was not a spontaneous outburst of violence, but an industrial operation planned at the highest levels of government and implemented through a bureaucratic apparatus that spanned an entire continent. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942, in which senior Nazi officials coordinated the logistics of the final solution over a working lunch, remains one of the most chilling documents in modern history. A meeting of educated senior government officials discussing the murder of millions with administrative efficiency. Beyond the Holocaust, German forces carried out mass reprisal killings of civilian populations across occupied Europe, systematically starved Soviet prisoners of war, approximately 3.3 million of whom died in German captivity, and implemented policies of deliberate civilian starvation in occupied territories, including the siege of Leningrad, which killed an estimated 800,000 Soviet civilians over 872 days. The Nuremberg trials that followed established the legal framework for prosecuting crimes against humanity that all subsequent international tribunals have built upon. The United States. American war crimes are among the most politically contested entries on any such list, partly because the United States controls significant influence over the international institutions that might otherwise adjudicate them, and partly because acknowledging them requires confronting a gap between stated values and documented conduct that remains deeply uncomfortable. The My Lai Massacre of March 1968, in which American soldiers killed between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and elderly men over the course of several hours, resulted in a single conviction that produced 3.5 years of house arrest. The use of Agent Orange across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, a chemical defoliant that contaminated millions of acres, caused widespread birth defects and cancers among the Vietnamese population and affected American veterans for decades, was never prosecuted under any legal framework. The Abu Ghraib prison abuse scandal of 2003 and 2004, in which American military personnel subjected Iraqi detainees to systematic torture and humiliation that was photographed and distributed, resulted in prosecutions of low-ranking soldiers, while the senior officials who authorized or enabled the conditions were never charged. The CIA's Enhanced Interrogation Program, documented in a 2014 Senate Intelligence Committee report that ran to thousands of pages, described techniques that meet most legal definitions of torture applied to detainees held outside any judicial oversight. The Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's record of war crimes spans multiple decades and multiple theaters. and the scale of some of its individual acts has been obscured by the sheer volume of documented atrocities across the 20th century. The Katyn Massacre in 1940, in which Soviet secret police executed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police, and intellectuals, shooting each one in the back of the head in a forest in western Russia, was blamed on Germany for decades before Soviet authorities finally acknowledged responsibility in 1990. During World War II, Soviet forces advancing westward through Central Europe in 1944 and 1945 carried out mass killings and systematic crimes against civilian populations on a scale that Western historians spent decades underreporting due to Cold War political dynamics. The Holodomor, the engineered famine that killed between 3.5 and 7 million Ukrainians between 1932 and 1933 through deliberately imposed food confiscation and border sealing, was officially denied by the Soviet government for over 50 years. Soviet forces also used chemical weapons in Afghanistan during the 1979 to 1989 occupation and conducted indiscriminate bombing campaigns against civilian populations that the limited international media presence in the country went largely unrecorded. Britain. The British Empire's catalog of documented crimes spans 4 centuries and 5 continents, and the challenge in discussing it is less finding examples than choosing between them. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed between 2 and 3 million people in British-controlled India, while the colonial administration continued exporting food from the region, and Winston Churchill reportedly dismissed Indian suffering with recorded contempt. The concentration camps of the Anglo-Boer War, the first large-scale use of that term in modern history, killed an estimated 28,000 Boer civilians and an unknown number of black Africans through disease and deliberate neglect. In Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s, British forces operated detention camps where systematic torture was documented. Villages were burned and an estimated 150,000 Kenyans were held in conditions the British government's own internal documents described with alarm. The British government resisted acknowledging these crimes for decades and only formally admitted to abuses in Kenya in 2013, paying compensation to over 5,000 surviving victims after documents that should have been destroyed were discovered still held in a secret archive. France. France's conduct in Algeria between 1954 and 1962 represents one of Western Europe's most thoroughly documented and most persistently denied bodies of war crimes from the post-war period. The Algerian War of Independence killed an estimated 500,000 to 1.5 million Algerians, a range reflecting both the scale of the violence and the difficulty of establishing accurate records in a conflict the French government spent decades characterizing as a domestic security operation rather than a war. French military forces used systematic torture against Algerian detainees as official policy, a practice documented by French journalists, military officers, and intellectuals at the time, suppressed by government censorship, and acknowledged officially only in 2018 when President Emmanuel Macron described it as a crime against humanity during a visit to Algeria. The Paris Massacre of October 1961, in which French police killed an estimated 200 Algerian demonstrators in the streets of Paris, dumping bodies in the Seine, was officially denied for 30 years before the French government began partial acknowledgement in the 1990s. The full death toll of that single night has never been officially established. Turkey. The Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1916 remains one of the most historically documented and most stubbornly denied mass atrocities of the 20th century. Under the cover of World War I, the Ottoman government, the direct predecessor of the modern Turkish state, orchestrated the systematic deportation and killing of the Armenian population within its borders. Men of military age were separated and executed. Women, children, and elderly people were marched into the Syrian desert in death convoys with no food or water. Villages were burned, mass killings were carried out along the deportation routes by military units and irregular forces. The death toll is estimated between 600,000 and 1.5 million people. The Ottoman government's own internal telegrams ordering the deportations and killings to provincial governors have been in the historical record for over a century. Turkey has maintained continuously since the founding of the modern state that the deaths resulted from wartime displacement and disease rather than deliberate policy, a position position that has made the question of recognition one of the most persistent diplomatic fault lines in modern international relations. As of 2021, over 30 countries formally recognize the Armenian genocide. Turkey has recalled its ambassador from several of them in response. Cambodia. The crimes of the Khmer Rouge government between 1975 and 1979 represent one of the most complete attempts at societal destruction in recorded history. Not a targeted genocide against a specific ethnic group, but a systematic assault on an entire population carried out by that population's own government. In 4 years, the Khmer Rouge killed an estimated 1.7 to 2.5 million people, roughly a quarter of Cambodia's entire population, through execution, forced labor, deliberate starvation, and the elimination of anyone associated with education, professional skills, religion, or perceived connections to the previous government. Cities were emptied at gunpoint within days of the regime taking power. Hospitals were shut down. Currency was abolished. The country was effectively sealed from the outside world while the killing proceeded. The Tuol Sleng detention facility in Phnom Penh processed an estimated 17,000 prisoners, of whom approximately 12 survived. The Khmer Rouge leadership remained at large for decades after Vietnamese forces ended the regime in 1979. Pol Pot died in 1998 without facing trial. The UN-backed tribunal established to prosecute surviving leaders did not deliver its first verdict until 2010, 31 years after the regime fell. If you made it this far, drop a comment below and let us know which country you want us to cover. Subscribe so you never miss an upload. There is a lot more where this came from.